Hello, my name is Harold Furchtgott-Roth here at the Hudson Institute and the Center for the Economics of the Internet. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet's review of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. With us today is Commissioner Michael O'Reilly, formerly a commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. He was one of the original staff members working on the Telecommunications Act of 1996, together with yours truly. And so together, we will have a brief review here of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. We hope you enjoy our review today. Commissioner O'Reilly, welcome to the Hudson Institute's discussion of the review of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, Harold, it's a pleasure to be here, Commissioner. Who would have thought 25 years later we'd look so good, right? Hair's a little grayer, we're a little older. I've got an extra weight. I was in much better shape in those days, but it's been a fun 25 years.
That's right. You were in the first grade and I was in the third grade, and I'm going to stick to that. And in full disclosure, I think we are the only two staffers who worked on the act who were then punished. We got sent to the FCC as commissioners to implement the act. So we must have done something wrong over the years.
Well, I put my hand up for the job. I enjoyed it, and then it came to an end, and you move on gracefully.
Well, let's set the stage. Let's tell the audience about the background. So what was communications law before the Telecommunications Act of 1996?
Well, as you know, and can describe better than I can, certainly, communications law is governed by a couple of different statutes, but mainly Communications Act of 1934, and hadn't been updated in an awful long time. Maybe many of the provisions predating the 34 Act from the 27 Radio Act. And so you had provisions that, were due to be adjusted. It's certainly high on the list were the Bell Company provisions and how Bell companies are to be regulated as it relates to the breakup of the old Ma Bell system in the mid 80s. It wasn't until the mid 90s that Congress got to finalize some of those things, but a lot of effort went along those lines to get to that point. And so it was a long and arduous process and timing, but Congress able to come across the threshold.
So 62 years by my count between 1934 and 1996. And did Congress just wake up in 1996 and say, let's just pass an act? Or had they been working on this for a long time?
Well, they had been working on it quite a long time, and a number of bills had moved forward at different stages. There was a bill that moved out of the House. The previous Congress stalled, and people still look upon that as one of the precursors to the 96 Act. And certainly a number of the provisions are similar. But as you know, our boss at the time, Tom Bliley, put his own stamp on the previous Congress's act. Bill anyway, and change it substantially in a number of different areas. We're coming off of, the timing, you put it in context a little bit, I think is only fair. Coming off of the election in November of 1994, a huge change in the Congress makeup. The House of Representatives changed power, hadn't been in, previous to my lifetime. And you saw, huge class of freshman members, number that made it onto the House then Commerce Committee, as our boss had renamed it, and so it was important to put his measurement and his ideas and his thoughts into that bill that moved through the committee process and then into the conference committee.
That's right, and by my review, there were there were hearings on the Communications Act. And draft bills going back to 1970s or so. So it had been 20 years or more of effort of Congress leading up to the 1996 Act. And so tell us a bit about your recollections of being a staffer at the time. So we were both working for Tom Bliley, one of the great legislators, in my view, in recent history, and just a great man. Tell us a bit about your recollections of working on the 96 Act?
Well, you nailed the last part, and I think it's important to highlight really for me and for anyone who's not familiar. Tom Blythe is a great person, and a great character and a great family man, and would rather have spent time with his family than on Meet the Press or any of the talk shows on then were popular during the day. You don't get them as much now, but he enjoyed spending, and certainly enjoys his family more than anything else. He saw his role as very important, but put it, had put it in a right priority, in my opinion, for how. But my recollections, to get to your question though, my recollections of those times, I don't know if it's haunting me or just as a good memory or something I've lost as I've become a parent. But those conversations we had, the 96 Act, really 1995. It's really February to December. Are pretty haunting to my life. I can remember them vividly. All the different machinations and all the different, from leadership and from then getting to the conference, all those kind of conversations that occurred through the months ahead were really, innovative, really interesting, really, time consuming. The effort was extensive by all involved. All had seen, all the staff who had been part of the process seemed committed to the end goal, even if they didn't agree with all the provisions. Its time had come, in my opinion, where everyone had put down their swords and were trying to pick up their pencils and make something happen. And I wish I was a little older. I was, very naive to the subject matter. I learned an awful lot through the process of being involved in, every day, listening to the experts and staff who've been so knowledgeable on the topic. Where we should go and how did the different pieces fit into the 34 Act and whether they should be incorporated into the 34 Act or can reside outside. So many different stages to consider. So many different decisions were made by a great team. And so I have great memories of that time period, all the different conversations from outside parties, our hearing process, every single thing is ingrained, and I took those lessons. And I made sure, what's it going to be? How's Mike O'Reilly going to operate going forward? And I made sure that, from that point, after the 96 Act, that in any conversation, I wanted to be the most knowledgeable person in the room because I had the highest regard and respect for those that had worked on the 96 Act and what they knew. And that wasn't my history. That wasn't my background. And I felt inferior to them. And after that, I was like, I will always know my subject matter on anything that I'm advocating on behalf of my boss. It's one of those lessons, life lessons that stuck with me during my time in government.
Commissioner, you mentioned there had been a major election in November of 1994 and a shift in party control of both the House and the Senate. Now, some viewers might think that the 96 Act was a partisan bill that was passed along party lines. Was that the case?
Oh, absolutely not. If you look at the folks that were involved in this, the legislators that were involved in this, you have Tom Blythe, conservative Republican in Richmond. You got John Dingell, who, Tom Blythe spent a lot of time making sure they were on the same page, did not want to separate from him, even though they had different philosophies on governing and legislating, but certainly worked hard to make sure those relationships remained strong. You had Ed Markey. I heard a recent speech on his and his vision. And him and his relationship with Tom Blythe, legendary. And then you have Jack Fields from Texas. The four of them really, got along as best they could in terms of personalities, different structures. But it was a bipartisan effort, and the numbers reflect that in different votes, whether they be in the committee or subcommittee, committee, on the floor. Yeah, there were disagreements on amendments, and there were amendments that went down, and some I wish had failed that actually made it into the bills and into the final law. I wish they didn't succeed. I struggled with a lot of them after. I'm sure you did when you were at the commission. A couple of language that should have been clear, that they got dropped out for different reasons, and we lost a couple floor amendments that hurt. But overall, it was a very bipartisan effort. And then you had the Senate. You had legendary Fritz Hollings working with Larry Pressler, working through that committee, and the numbers are overwhelming in the Senate as well, and how they were able to work through it. And at the end of the day, the President Clinton has this huge ceremony at the Library of Congress, and everybody's there. It's not only the government officials, it's all of industry, it's all the public advocates, and everybody's embracing the outcome. There were a couple no votes, let's not kid ourselves, but bipartisanship was a hallmark of how Tom Brady operated as best he could and how he legislated.
That's right. I mean, there were over 400 votes for it in the House. I think there were over 90 votes for it in the Senate. It's really an extraordinary outcome. And it was passed during a very acrimonious period in Washington. I recall government shutdowns, and the staff were meeting all the way through the government shutdowns to try to get the bill out. You have some recollections of that period of time?
Well, of course, it was one of those things that, the time to be labeled essential was of importance in terms of the work could continue. I had a designation. I wasn't sure it was going to play out that way, but it did. And yeah, you had government shutdown. You had, just a very tough Congress. It was really hard work. And the first 100 days of that Congress pushed a lot of legislation out the door, out of the Commerce Committee. And some of it necessarily wasn't, bipartisan. A little bit, had some vision of where the Congress wanted to go, and the new leadership from Newt Gingrich wanted to take it. But if you look at what after you move that aside, you see what the effort was in committee and overwhelming support for this. Absolutely, we survived a very contentious time, as very memorable, very enjoyable in retrospect, I must admit, but on a very tough, every day the bill would go like this. Is it going to move? Is it going to die? I mean, it had been called dead a couple different times. I think back of a comment that Mike Oxley made, former congressman from Ohio, who said it was deader than Elvis. And it wasn't, but like a couple of weeks later, it was Elvis had rejoined her life, and it wasn't soon after that we got it out of the conference that had concluded. And so it was one of those things where at any point in the time, it could have been, the plug could have been pulled. It had been pulled many times before, as you highlighted, 20 some odd years of effort, but it didn't, and kept plugging along, and you finally get to the end point of a very successful outcome. And there's still, at some point we should get to the substance, because there's a lot of good things to embrace, and then there's some things that naturally occurs as part of legislating and what happens on Capitol Hill, and those lessons will stay with me forever as well. I'm sure they will as you. I don't. Your memory is similar to mine.
Well, let's move on to the substance, and let's talk about some of the things. Let's begin with some of the things that played out pretty much as you might have expected back in 1996. I can think of some areas. What are there some areas that you think of back in 1996 and they played out? Yeah, that's pretty much how I thought they might play out.
Well, look, I think that the heart of the legislation, and I'm happy to be corrected, but as I look upon it, the heart of the legislation is the local telephone company provisions. How do you deal with opening up the local telephone market? And then the trade-off that was made by Congress that they would allow the existing Bell companies to enter the long distance market. And that trade, effectively did happen, and it worked effectively, in my opinion. It was short timed. Maybe it didn't last as long as people thought it would. It certainly, had a positive effect. I think that no one knew at the time, and this goes back to something you highlighted early on, nobody knew at the time that the internet was going to go in a different direction, and the market for some of those services were going to go in a different direction. But the heart of the legislation was the trade-off that worked, fairly good, for a good amount of time, maybe 7-8 years. But from that, you had this dynamic industry, new competitors, racing forward, building, infrastructure and competing networks that really changed the dynamic of the communications industry. And that infrastructure, well, not directly related, at least in my opinion, some others have a different light on it, certainly fed into the internet. And a lot of the pieces, a lot of the fiber optics that were installed in major urban markets were the building blocks for the then modernizing the internet and backbone to what we have today.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of the Section 251 through 271 provisions worked out sort of as people thought. I think there was an expectation that there would be this dynamic CLEC industry develop, which it did for a couple of years. And then it kind of fizzled out. Not because competition didn't work. I think it was that no one really fully figured out at the time that what was going to happen is broadband and online services would take over from circuit switch technologies. And these markets that we thought were so important back in 1996, long distance services, they don't exist anymore. It's not a market. And so technology has changed and kind of provided a different, and I would argue a superior form of competition than the statute could have ever imagined.
I don't know if anyone could sit back at the time, if we put everybody around around a table in a room, staff working on, or even members could say, do you think in 25 years there'd be no AT&T? Yes, it's renamed, but it's because of the purchase. There'd be no MCI. There'd be no Sprint, and most of the long distance industry completely collapsed. And then on the local market, there'd be very few players left. That there's certainly nobody using 10% maybe at circuit switched copper lines. The VoIP market has pretty much eliminated all of that. I don't know if anyone would have put money on that or would have gambled that was what the case may be. Certainly the CLEC industry grew. Some of those companies existed in one form or another now, but most of them did evaporate. But I don't think that we would have seen such huge change in the marketplace. I could have envisioned what would have happened at that time, and that's part of the difficulty that Congress has to play. What's its role, and how far can it see in the future when it drafts legislation?
But to some extent, I think that's one of the beauties of the Telecom Act is it allowed for competition. It enabled companies, whether they're online or not, to be able to say, we're going to provide these services and you can't stop us. Whereas before the 96 Act, I think it's up to some debate as to whether a lot of these online services would even be lawful today. But you're right, sitting in 1996, no one on Capitol Hill, or frankly, no one in America would have said, oh, in 25 years, what are the 6 largest corporations in the world? And their names are going to be Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and Tesla. Some people might have guessed Apple and Microsoft, but the other 4 didn't even exist. And they're by far the 6 largest corporations in the world today, all of which have a very active role directly or indirectly in the communication space. I think another area that was probably worked out sort of, at least as you might have expected, was the cable industry and the deregulation of the 92 Act. And that was fairly immediate. And you got to see new investment in the cable industry that had kind of dried up over 4 years.
That's absolutely fair, and I think it's because the provisions are mostly explicit, right? They were very clear on the cable side what Congress wanted, and the edits in the statute, completely changed, to the word what Congress was expecting, and you see that compared differently to some of the changes we saw in the media ownership space, and then what we left with in 202H. And the biennial review that turns into the quadrennial mess that both you and I had to live with at the commission.
I'm glad you raised that. I'd have to say, of all of the provisions of the 96 Act, the one that I think surprises me the most is media ownership. And it's a trivial part now. But if you'd asked me in 1996, what's going to happen in 2 years, I would have said, media ownership rules are going to be gone. They're gone. No question. They're out of here. And I think, candidly, I think that was the intent of Congress at the time. There was, as I recall, I could be wrong, but it was something like this. The media ownership rules were eliminated in the House bill. And the Senate bill, to kind of keep them on board, we came up with this space-saving thing. There'll be some review, but everyone assumed they'd be gone. And here we are, 25 years later, and these archaic rules from the 1970s, and some of them, frankly, from the 30s and 40s are still with us.
Well, you're absolutely right. But if I were asked, what are the provisions that cause the most, maybe the angst or surprise, definitely one that high on the list that nobody thought we're going to have so much influence would be 706. I think that's been tortured to completely by the Congress and the courts and the FCC. I mean, just absolutely mangled. 202H, of course. I think the preamble has been abused. Something that has no statutory weight has been used, in numerous FCC items. It shouldn't have been given. If we thought that the commission was going to give so much weight to it, we would have spent more time on it. I think it was just one of those trade away things. Like it's almost like trading away the number of the bill. You didn't really care because the language was supposed to be more governing than this sentence and the framework of how how it's to be structured. But that was and then I would say 257 and some of the reviews, the 3-year reviews on some of the ownership issues really surprises me. How they've been treated by the commission. I might look at the poll attachments as being one of the thing that's still so hotly contentious. Even it was more explicit in the statute than some of the others, and then the citing provisions, of course, wireless tower citing. And where we are, those provisions, probably weren't add-ons, but they certainly weren't the main invitees to the dance, but still live and now garner more attention than many others, and they surprise me for those reasons. It's how much weight, how much time, how much effort has gone into the 706 report, and how much what's the governing philosophy behind it, and what were the members thinking, and it really was not as significant as. In my recollection, as people give it a heightened attention now, but I refer back to your 202H conversation. I think maybe it was a two-stepper for me, where maybe not in 2 years, but it was like they do one hump in 2 years, and then the 4 years they probably get rid of most everything on the media ownership. I thought it might take a two tranche effort, given where the Senate was. It may take a little bit more effort on media ownership. But not certainly where we are now, which is exactly where we then, where we were then. So those are kind of things that jump out at me, and having lived through them at the commission and past implementation days after you had moved on to higher power. I don't know if you have any thoughts on those or others that jump out at you.
Well, let me just review some of those with you, Commissioner O'Reilly. First of all, Section 706. I always think of that as Senator Conrad Burns's provision. Senator Conrad Burns was one of the most conservative members of the Senate, and I'm sure he would have been absolutely shocked if his provision, which is entirely about deregulation, about opening up markets if there was not enough broadband deployment, if he knew that was going to be used to try to impose regulation. That would be completely mangling the intent of Congress on Section 706. The preamble, Commissioner, I was kind of the skunk at the picnic during a lot of the staff conference meetings. And at the very end, I think they threw me this bone of, Harold, you're always telling us come up with a few words for a preamble. And so I wrote, I think I drafted it. A lot of other people contributed to it, but I think it's probably the only part of the act I can actually claim. And it was supposed to be completely worthless because you're right. It has no enforcement. It's just a preamble. It's nothing. And yet people have interpreted it in ways that it's supposed to be deregulatory. That's all it really means. Somehow it's gotten mangled to mean something entirely different. Some of the other provisions you mentioned have gotten interpreted in ways that are very surprising. One section you didn't mention, which I thought you might, is Section 230. Can you tell us a bit about Section 230?
Well, look, it's been it is an ongoing discussion amongst every single person that I can see on Twitter. Everyone's turned into a prognosticator and a constitutional scholar and a statutory interpreter about this one provision and how it is changed the entire internet and how it has either saved or harmed everybody in between. It's very interesting, and I'd love your take on the substance of it. But I look at it as a as a process perspective. I look at it as the House effort and the votes that we actually had. And you may recall this as I do, being in the basement of the Capitol, and when a number of the senators are pushing the Communications Decency Act. Senator Exxon certainly moving forward with it, but he had a number of his conferees that were supportive of it, and he had a number of House members that were supportive of it. The internet pornography issue had certainly bubbled up, and members were cautious of being on the wrong side of that, and he found himself in a majority of position, or certainly in a place where he could be successful. And you saw the House respond with the idea that we'll put both in, knowing, I think that most House members found the CDA to completely unconstitutional. And that's why you saw the expedited, review by the court system as a mechanism to diffuse that. And also it was the institution or the adoption of the 230 provision, which I've had the opportunity to listen to the authors, and our boss obviously had some say in the matter, but I listened to Chris Cox of California, former member, and Ron Wyden, formerly from Oregon, who was a House member and now is in the Senate. And I've listened to them debate what they intended, and how it's played out. And to see, like I said, I'm coming at this from a process perspective, and see where it's come from, and what they intended and what they see in the marketplace today. And in fairness, I look at the statute and I say, this was the debate that was had at the time, and it's operating as intended. It provides immunity to those, interactive services, the platforms, people would say to that, today, though it's not the term that's used. It provides immunity from the content of the users, that the government won't interfere with their ability to monitor and adjust the network. We expected them to do important things and to help guide their platforms as they saw fit. We thought there would be an active competitive universe, as there was at the time, a very dynamic, for those that were either AOL users or CompuServe, a number of different things. We thought that that universe was fairly competitive, I think. The authors did, certainly, and we wanted them to have the flexibility and not be sideswiped by the court system into steps that they weren't expected to take. And so I think it's a counterweight to the Communications Decency Act, the rest of the statutory provisions, the language that and the penalties that Senator Exxon and others had tried to to instill, that since went off the rails. I don't know if you agree with any of my interpretation, but that doesn't get you much to the substance, but it certainly gets you to what I think is how we are in terms of process.
No, I like you, I vividly recall much of the discussion with the members and the staff. And as you point out, I think it's very interesting that it was the melding of the Cox-Wyden provisions with Senator Exxon's Communications Decency Act. And so some of the language is very much framed really in terms of child protection. And then I remember we on the House staff side wound up consulting with one of the leading First Amendment lawyers in the world, Lloyd Abrams, and he gave us some advice about some of the language. And, courts reviewed it and kind of tossed out the Consumer Decency Act provisions part. But there still is vestigial language from that that is still there. But I also have to say, sitting at my recollection in 1996, if someone said, which provision of the act are people going to be discussing 25 years from now, I would have been hard pressed to think Section 230 was the the one that was going to be capturing the imagination of lots of people. But that's really how it has turned out, at least in 2021, as we sit here today.
Can I tell you another provision that I'm just shocked that I spent so much time at the commission? Regulating payphones. The payphones. it turned into a provision on the language, as you know, was, and what it's intended to do has been totally migrated. And the debate is now about prison payphones. And none of that was ever contemplated in the 96 Act. I don't even remember the word prison ever came up in anyone's, mindset at all. But that's, I spent way more time than I ever imagined when I took the job on prison payphones as it relates to the provisions, in the act. I would never have thought that how much airtime it would get.
No, and when I was a commissioner, I spent a lot of time actually on payphones, and we kept losing in court, and then on prisons, the commission has continued that tradition and kept losing in court. I think the net result is trying to regulate prices of anything is not a good thing, and the commission is really not very good at it. And unfortunately, I have a sneaking suspicion the commission in the coming year or two is going to spend a lot of time attempting to do what the commission does badly, which is regulate prison rates.
It's possible, but I never understood, and I've made this point to the advocates. I understood what they were seeking. What I never when I could never get across to them is that you had a receptive Congress. I came from that body, and there were members on both sides of the aisle that were willing to consider, amendments. Didn't necessarily have to be as part of the Communications Act in the language that we drafted many years ago. It could be in some other statute to give the commission authority or to tell the Congress, the wishes of Congress on what they want to do on prison payphones. There was a receptive audience. And it wasn't until like the last 2 years of my time when legislation was introduced. And I never understood, the reluctance to go to Congress and actually clarify rather than try and bulldoze forward and use language that was really difficult. And also to denigrate, different people's opinion. I understand the arguments on the cost of prison payphones. I just never, I was getting attacked for not voting for it as somehow some kind of implication on my social, views of prisoners, and it was nothing of the sort. It was, statutory construction, and I just so anyway. I bring that provision up as just something that you look back and see what got so much airtime, so much attention after the fact that nobody would have imagined. There's so many different pieces you would have, and I think of those things that didn't get much attention, whether it be, the Bell operating, equipment prohibitions and things that didn't matter. Very quickly, we knew that they were not interested in those businesses, and so didn't really have any impact. But so many other things have been interpreted elsewise. It's comical in some instances.
Right. Another provision that never went anywhere that we spent a lot of time on was something called, I think it was online video platform. It was some kind of shared video platform, and I don't think it ever really saw the light of day.
No, there were a number of cable companies that took it up, but they quickly found, that it wasn't the right model for their regulatory process, and they were also beaten down by some of the regulators, both state and federal guys who didn't want them to go that route and didn't like the use of the provision. It's tempting to how much time we spent on that provision. And how much it didn't actually have any impact is intriguing. It's very intriguing.
Well, you mentioned that you've spent a lot of time in the Senate, and you have a good sense of the sensibilities of Congress and where Congress might be interested in amending the Communications Act again, or where it may not. There's always discussion about rewriting parts of the 96 Act. Tell us what you think are the provisions that have attracted the most attention on Capitol Hill in terms of possible areas for rewriting.
I look at this Congress and I defer to the legislators to what they think they can accomplish. I think it's really tough. I've lived through Senate days when the numbers are really tight, and it's hard to move things. It's so easy to stop things from moving forward. And so last couple Congresses I've testified, advocated that we work on a rewrite. It never got any, that we as a collective nation work on a rewrite. The legislature push things forward. We, as a commission, could advocate for certain things, help them out, draft things if need be, provide our expertise. It never worked out. It never got too much. Those are wider margins, between the parties. And now you have such a tight Congress. It seems like a very heavy lift. It's possible, and you see some agreement, but I'd probably put my money against anything happening. But if you put out, what should it look like, and do you rewrite the '96 Act? And I'm not sure you do. There's pieces of it that I think you could address more clearly and provide certainty. But the debate has moved on. A lot of things that are not in most of the wireless industry is not in the '96 Act. It's addressed through the OBRA 93. But then we've worked on it since then. In my past life, and we worked on the Spectrum Act of 2012, where you got Ray Baum's Act, and a number of things have moved forward in provisions regarding 345 to 355, one of my favorite bands that recently got attention by Congress. And so I think that there's a lot of good that can be done in the communication space legislatively, but I'm not sure it's rewriting or addressing the '96 Act. We need to address the local telephone competition provisions. Probably not. Do the principles that guided that debate still apply? In many instances, yes, but they don't. How they would be interpreted or how they would apply to modern communications may not be exactly the same. You're not dialing parity or numbering portability. Some of those things, either the technology took care of itself or no longer applicable. Do telephone numbers, are they still going to exist in the next 10 years or even 5? Those things are what I hope that Congress would spend its time on: forward-leaning, forward action, forward provisions rather than backwards. And rewriting the '96 Act is probably not a priority, but figuring out what should we keep going forward, what should be the landscape for, and how should broadcasters be regulated, if at all? How should cable entities be regulated? The video marketplace be regulated, if at all? Those are things that are essential. I'm sure there'll be great interest in relitigating the net neutrality debate, something that's, I thought was about 15 years old. Someone pointed out to me recently, I think it's 20 years old. And I think that's kind of, that is a component. And we look upon it now, someone say, oh, that's the engine that'll drive the train of all the rest of the pieces. And that to me looks like the '96 Act's local telephone competition. We're in a time period, not too distant future, we can look back and go, that really wasn't as significant as we thought it was going to be. It really isn't that important, and really wasn't the telltale driver of the marketplace that we thought it could be over time. To me, the engines in both instances could be irrelevant.
Well, I agree with much of what you said. I certainly would not think there would be a rewrite of the whole '96 Act. I think that just isn't happening. It's always a good bet to bet against Congress legislating on much of anything. But there are specific provisions that have attracted a lot of attention, whether it's broadcast ownership rules or Section 230. Or prisoner
payphones,
or there are other. These are very very targeted issues. Section 222 on CP&I. There are a lot of issues that you can almost imagine a rifle shot provision getting attached to a spending bill or something like that. But you're right. I think there's zero chance of a broad-based rewrite of communications law. I don't think there's any consensus on any of that. But there might be individual provisions that get some attention. Although, again, I think the odds are probably bet against even those.
Well, I think that there's as someone who looks at it from this side of the table versus the government side for so many years, I think there's there are a good number of provisions that I think that if you package them together could be a bill that you could take to Congress and say, what do you think of this? It balances all the different interests, some for this side, some for that side, some for this group, some for that group, and you could figure out a trade-off for all the different provisions that could go into the bill. But actually getting congressional time on the Senate floor these days, that seems like a heavy lift. But we'll just have to see, I guess. There's just so many little pieces now that are. 222 is a great example where had been butchered by a previous commission, and then Congress answers it. Congressional Review Act. And now will Congress come back and address this in some form or fashion to be determined? But rifle shot seems like a heavy lift because of the lots of rifle shots that have been attempted on so many different pieces over the last many years, on so many things that people have tried to get through and haven't been able to be successful. I think at 230, the hard part about 230, and I've made this this comment before, is that everyone seems to be agree that 230 is worthy of a review and potentially reform. There's some that would like to repeal it, but say the most majority is for some type of reform. But they come at it from different perspectives. Most Republicans or conservatives are worried, most anyway, are worried about how the platforms, how the big tech treat conservative voices, and are they subjective, and how the algorithms work. And on the other side, most Democrats, and not all, but many Democrats, have been worried about how the information, misinformation, and how the platforms have been able to share conspiracy and nutty ideas without any retribution or vengeance or correction. How about that? Without any correction. And I think those two things make it really hard to find a middle ground, even if everyone agrees in the overall premise of some type of reform. So I think it becomes a heavier lift, even if it's a common theme.
No, I think you're right. I don't see any consensus about what direction Section 230 reform would look like. One area I have heard outside of the FCC, but has some FCC implications, is there's a lot of work going on Capitol Hill on FTC reform on various issues there. And particularly if the new FCC decides to revisit network neutrality in a Title II form, which would, of course, take FTC jurisdiction away on common carriers. So one area that I might be able to see Congress doing something if they actually wind up doing anything on FTC reform is addressing that, because it would be part of any sort of privacy review the FTC would have.
Yeah, I look at the potential addressing FTC issues, and I think it may be something legislation can get enacted. It's probably more in terms of guidance and direction, to send messages to the FTC. But I think I'm expecting an aggressive FTC. I'm not saying I would agree with it or what they may do, but I'm imagining a very active and probably the most active FTC in terms of the debate and the lobbying and all the different efforts and all the attention heading more to the FTC or DOJ versus the commission. And certainly the FCC, and certainly that's not how it's played out over the many years. The FCC has been, mostly the attention grabber for lots of different reasons. The FTC has been more, able to operate without so much attention and do its work. And I think that's going to flip a little bit and certainly get much more active in the space. It doesn't mean all the ideas are going to be good or what they do is good or bad. I don't make any commentary, but I think it's going to be a more active FTC. And then the FCC is bound to be, active, but you have a number of months that will still be with an acting chairperson and finding a third seat for the majority. So some of that will be tempered for a time period, a short time period, obviously. And then there's just, a lot of things on the plate because what things Congress have already given the commission, obligations they have expected from them, that will keep them preoccupied and pretty busy.
Commissioner, you mentioned before network neutrality. Do you expect this new commission to address network neutrality? And if they do you think they're going to do it again with a Title II approach?
Oh, absolutely. I expect this commission to be, that I don't think anyone can get on the commission or be chairperson of the commission from the Democratic side without, swearing an oath to move net neutrality. The current members support it, and anyone who's seeking to go that direction are going to be supportive of it. So absolutely, I think it's going to be a Title II approach. Where I think you're going to be will be interesting debate. Does it look? They start with the Tom Wheeler approach and the final where he ended up in the discussion, that which I disagreed with, or do they look at the Tom Wheeler approach and then do Tom Wheeler plus? Do they add ideas on top of that? Those areas where Tom didn't want to go as far as maybe some other in the party at the time, but now seem to be common threads. Tom was forbearing, and the commission forbore from a lot of provisions in the 34 Act and in Title II don't apply. But I think that this commission there'll be a lot of pressure from outside groups to not be so widely sweeping in terms of limiting the commission's authority. So things like rate regulation, I think, are very much on the table, not in a good way per se, but I think it's very much on the table for debate. Now, maybe it's for purposes of leverage or purposes of pushing bully pulpit and pushing the debate forward. But I think it's front and center. It's not just we're just going to take Tom Wheeler, rubber stamp it, and move it forward. I think the debate has changed a little bit, just as it was from the first time I approached it, in 2005, and others would say 2000 was the origination. The debate has always morphed over time, and what they wanted from advocates has changed. And if you hear people describe what now is net neutrality compared to 2005, you would laugh because there was probably close to a deal in 2005. In terms of if we were having that debate now, we would probably, most Republicans would probably live with what was contemplated in 2005. Not everything, but most things. And now the debate is morphed entirely in a different direction. I think it'd be harmful. The whole provision that Tom had in the previous commission's authorities relates to basically a roving enforcement bureau to see and act as it so chose, to be the basically blessing of any new business model. I think that certainly is something that was never contemplated before, and now will just be heightened going forward. And so net neutrality, absolutely. What it looks like, probably to be determined, but in my mind, it's a previous commission plus.
You mentioned Section 10 forbearance, and one of the things that surprised me about the implementation of the 96 Act was really how infrequently Section 10 was invoked, and how Section 11 and regulatory review has never taken place in 25 years. Never. They've never really done it. And it was a clever approach, maybe clever by half approach, for Chairman Wheeler to try to meld the two, to do network neutrality, Title II plus Section 10. And it never really got challenged in the court because there was a change of administration soon, and it never really happened. How do you see that playing out? Is there a tension between designating something as Title II and at the same time, even before it's even been implemented, saying, well, we're going to forbear from this, we're going to have this menu of options, and we're just going to play around with what we really think Title II is going to mean just for this particular service?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's very problematic, both from a legal standpoint and also practical standpoint, for companies to try and be able to offer services. It did survive court, at least interpretation, for the ability to get the blessing.
For Title II, yeah, right.
Yeah, and the rest didn't get really reviewed. It's interesting how those cases proceed, and what there be the strength and the arguing points of what how things are going to play out. But you're absolutely right. It's interesting to see. I look at Section 10 and I say what how the commission had abused it or mangled it over the years, and the test that they had created to get something through. Was it the U.S. West or the Meritech test? It was just absolutely infuriating for anyone who had to live through the trade-offs. So my difficulty with the 96 Act is a lot of the trade-offs, the balancing act, only one side was able to win. So if the trade-off was you get some dereg in broadcast ownership, or you have a dereg in Section 10, or you have 706 as dereg, a lot of those got abused and didn't get to be fully active as members had interpreted. But the trade-off that they made for other provisions, in many other instances, more regulatory provisions, those fully got implemented and still live on today. And so that's the hard part about legislation. And I made this point recently that I think it's so important for Congress to be more specific in drafting law. It's hard, I know, especially on items where there's not agreement, and you hope to be able to, what if we punt this to the regulators? They can figure it out. They know what we're trying to find, the happy medium. And I think that you see from the 96 Act some issues where they were punted and they did a decent job, and others they didn't. And that's the something I would go back and do differently. That you and something I took with me after the job. I'm sure you did in other debates as well, where I made clear that, in new bills that I drafted, in new language that I negotiated, I was very clear what I wanted the commission to do, but more importantly, what I didn't want it to do, where I prohibited from doing certain things. That was so key in my mind. And this is just an interesting debate to look back and see how Section 10 was so mangled over the years. They pretty much defanged it. If people thought it was so significant, it was going to gut the statute, because you not only do you have the opportunity to use it to overturn regulations, but you can overturn or set aside statutory provisions. And someone recently said to me there's a model you could use in other regulatory bodies in town, but it never got full use in this commission or in the FCC's doctrine. It was just abused over the time by many different chairmen, and I'd hope that someday Congress can revisit that, but probably not high on the agenda.
I think part of the problem on both Section 10 and Section 11, and frankly, all of the regulatory reform acts of the early and mid 90s, is there's no enforcement provision. There's no private enforcement provision. Section 11, which we worked on, is very simple. It says the commission shall review every regulation every 2 years. That got interpreted by the commission as the commission shall never review any regulations ever. And but there's no one has standing to go to court and sort of say, commission, you got this wrong. It's just so the net effect is the commission figured out they could ignore provisions they didn't particularly want to deal with.
Well, they give credit to the commission, though. So many rulemakings were hatched because of the 96 Act, and so many hours and time, hours and days were invested by staff to implement many provisions that we cared so desperately about, and we talked about at the beginning of this, have since kind of moved past in terms of local competition provisions. They had a lot on their plate. I think it's some of the after effects and some of the, a statute's only as good for a time period. And my vision is my views in terms of how much you can hold the regulatory body to, if there is one, to feet to the fire. And it's probably about a 5-year window. And after that, you just see creative, staff and creative general counsels and creative chairmen take provisions in directions no one ever contemplated, and that's what we live with today. And redoing that universe is probably not expected or probably not appropriate. But hopefully the lessons from it will be something that people will live with, and hopefully I can keep sharing my views on some of these things, and you will as well. I certainly hope that that members, many of the principles that live through the 96 Act are carried through. I know I carried tech neutrality, which is different than net neutrality, but I carried tech neutrality in my time at the commission, and fought desperately for it in my many years in the Senate. And certainly got to a détente from the other side if they were unwilling to debate the issue out or move forward with tech mandates, which is always good to hear. And hopefully that can be, some of those principles will carry the day again.
Well, Commissioner, I could go on forever. I just want to end with one footnote, which is I was told when I got the commission they weren't going to enforce Section 11 because it was too difficult. The first summer I was a commissioner, I had a couple of dozen interns, and they did a Section 11. They reviewed every rule the commission had, and we found a bunch of rules such as requirements of Morse code training on ships and other things. And we turned over the results to the commission. The commission got rid of a bunch of archaic rules. So when the commission says we can't do it, my reaction is, oh yeah, well, let's see. Give me a bunch of interns and I'll see if a bunch of interns can do it. And in that case, actually, reviewing commission rules is not as difficult as the commission made it out to be. But let me not keep our audience longer. I promised I'd try to get this done in an hour, and let's do that. But I look forward to continuing this conversation. For anyone who wants to reach Commissioner O'Reilly, he can be reached here at the Hudson Institute. We're very happy to have him as a visiting fellow. And your email address, Commissioner, is?
Well, right now it's both at the Hudson Institute, MOreilly@Hudson and .org, and it's also at MikeO'Reilly1 at gmail.com.
Excellent. With that, thank you very much.